Welcome to your favorite YouTube channel, Cartoonist Kayfabe. My name is Ed Piskor.
I'm Jim Rugg.
Today, very special guest in the house. The great Bill Griffith is here with us. Jimmy, give a little bibliography and let's jump right into things.
Zippy the Pinhead. This is probably the first daily cartoonist that we've had on Cartoonist Kayfabe. So super excited to talk to him about that experience with Zippy the Pinhead. Underground background, co-publishing or co-editing Arcade, the Comics Review, and Young Lust in the 70s. And then starts making graphic novels in the 2000s with Invisible Ink, My Mother's Secret Love Affair with a Famous Cartoonist, Nobody's Fool, The Life and Times of Schlitzie the Pinhead. Last year's release, Three Rocks, the story of Ernie Bushmiller, the man who created Nancy, and also The Buildings Are Barking, Diane Newman in Memoriam, the first comic book format, I believe, that Bill has done in many years, as well as the 2023 Reuben Award winner for Cartoonist of the Year. Bill Griffith, welcome to Cartoonist Kayfabe.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Such an honor. Bill, you, probably more than a decade at this point, you are one of my biggest inspirations. I can't believe how you can do a daily comic strip and moonlight as a graphic novelist also. Like, how do you find the hours in a day? I think a piece of the conversation I'd like to have with you is about work schedule. How do you adjust things to make this all work out?
Well, it didn't all happen at the same time. It
Sure.
happened gradually. So back in the mid-'80s, when the San Francisco Examiner asked me to do ZIPPY Daily, which at that point had been self-syndicated to weekly, alternative papers, my first response was not really no, but why? That sounds like an incredible burden. Never my career goal. So I asked if they would use backlog strips for about 6 months to get me kind of up to speed and used to it, which they did. And then I found that doing a daily strip was kind of a natural rhythm for me. It's kind of like doing a diary entry every day. It's also a nice soapbox to have, to speak my cracked mind to the world. So that part of it kind of just seamlessly happened. Of course, at the time, I didn't have graphic novels to do. I didn't teach. My responsibilities were not as wide as they are today. But like, it all happened little by little. I guess the answer would be, I work 7 days a week. And it doesn't feel like a burden. It just feels like I get up in the morning, unless I have some reason to not work that day, like, appointments or, a cold or something. But otherwise, when I get up in the morning, I think my purpose in life is to sit in front of the drawing table and commune with some part of my brain that lets me do comics every day. And that's when I feel happiest, when I'm sitting at the drawing table working. I think it's like a drug. It's endorphins. Endorphins are coursing through my frontal lobes, and that keeps me going, I guess.
It's got to be cool having that sort of daily release too, to kind of build on that endorphin rush. You mentioned the weekly syndication stuff, and I don't think we've really had any of those alt-weekly cartoonists on here yet. So that is a little bit of a dark spot in our kind of historical knowledge. When you were doing the self-syndication, I guess stuff we would know from that time period would be, the sort of trinity of Charles Burns, Matt Groening, Linda Berry. But were you syndicating before them? And
Before them.
And who else was shared that model?
Durf, definitely. It's hard to remember way back into Zippy started as a weekly strip in the Berkeley Barb, only in that weekly newspaper, in 1975, I think. And so then it was, I think Ted Richards was in that group, and a couple of the Air Pirates cartoonists were in that. It was a page of the Barb devoted to comics, and I liked it because it was two color. It was black and orange. So I did little orange mechanical color separations on acetate and sent them over to the barb every week. Anyway, so that gave me the idea that, gee, there are more papers in the Berkeley Barb out there to pay $25 a week. So I got a list. I don't know, there was no internet, but there was a way to get a list. And I got the list, and then I send out queries to, I don't know, 75 different weeklies, and about 50 of them replied yes. And that was a decent part of my income for a while until the Examiner. But in there also, in what year? 79, 80, Ripoff Press, the underground publisher of the Freak Brothers, they started their own little comic syndicate. They syndicated a full half-page tabloid strip of mine every 2 weeks. Those strips were called Griffith Observatory. They also did a Fat Freddy's Cat half-page and a couple, I think Ted Richards also. Ted Richards was kind of living at Ripoff Press at that point. He was upstairs in their workroom. So that gave me a list too, because then all the papers that took the Griffith Observatory, I got their names and addresses. So I all sent them queries about running Zippy. So yeah, that's what I did. And I did all the bookkeeping. My philosophy was, if they didn't pay for a month, rather than just harass them, which would really do no good, I would just drop them. And that was what I did.
You were also doing like underground comics work at that time, right? Like those two things were overlapping?
Yeah, I mean, I started in underground comics. If you want to go right to the beginning, it was 1969. My first strips were with my character, Mr. Toad, and they were done for the sex tabloid in New York, Screw. And also the Gothic Blimp Works, which was a comic tabloid put up by the East Village Other newspaper. I also worked for the East Village Other. These were sporadic. I didn't make much of a living. I still had to have my day job. I think my last day job was packing books in a book distribution warehouse.
I feel like there's an Amazon warehouse joke in there somewhere, but
we're just not quick enough with it.
I guess what I'm curious about, Bill, is did you view these things differently, like doing comic book pages and comic books versus doing comic strips?
You mean strips as in the daily strip? Or?
Yeah, the daily or even the alt weeklies.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, in comic books in the underground days, this was my place to do long form narratives, anywhere from a couple of pages to 15 pages. So this was way before graphic novels. And that was my outlet for longer pieces. And so I did lots of stuff from 1970 to 75 for all kinds of underground comics at that time. Zippy debuted in the underground comic Real Pulp Comics #1 in 1971. That was the first Zippy appearance. It was in a 5-page story. And then in 75, Art Spiegelman and I put together Arcade, which was an attempt to leap from the underground distribution system into the magazine distribution system. Our dream was to appear next to the National Lampoon.
Sure.
That never happened. We were way too weird. Also, we never attracted advertising, and no distributor will seriously consider distributing your magazine if you don't have advertising. That's one of their rules.
It's pretty hardcore. Like, I remember strips that Aileen did where she's, fingering herself in the bathtub and stuff like that. Like, you could imagine that might be a slightly tough sale too.
Yeah. So, right.
I've never heard that about advertising being a requirement for distribution. Was the idea that the advertisers would sort of police the content?
Well, it would legitimize your publication. It means you were in the real world, you had a staff, and you sold advertising, and advertisers bought into your magazine. So they gave you a vote of confidence that you were a real magazine. There was a company called Eastern Eastern distribution that distributed, I think, Erie and a couple of kind of semi-fanzines about movies. And I think they distributed the National Lampoon, I'm not sure. But we had a contact there, and that's what they told us. They said, come back to us when you have advertising. So,
You know what this makes me realize? Bill, you were in San Francisco. I'm assuming, you're not far from, Gary Arlington's like comic shop and stuff. Did you ever meet Rory Hayes? Do you have any stories about him?
oh, of course, yeah, sure.
Tell us about him. You're the only guy that we've ever talked to who might have direct contact with that guy. He's an artist that we like a lot.
Yeah, I love Rory's work. Well, Rory, I would see Rory a lot when I dropped in on Gary Arlington's comic book store on 23rd Street near Mission in San Francisco. That was kind of the hangout for cartoonists, the underground cartoonists. So, I mean, I would go there just to see the latest stuff that was out, and I would go there to meet people. That's where I got together with Art Spiegelman when he first arrived in San Francisco, and we left from there to a nearby lunch place and hatched a comic book, and then eventually hatched Arcade. So anyway, so Rory was somebody you would see there a lot. He was just hanging out. You couldn't ignore Rory. One of his eyes was going in one direction, one was going in another direction. He didn't conform to any kind of hippie fashion. He looked like some kid out of the 1950s. He was incredibly polite. He called me Mr. Griffith when he talked to me. And you would never in a million years think that this seemingly childlike guy produced these horrifying, gut-wrenching drawings, which were largely due to Robert Crumb's influence. Before Crumb became friendly with Rory, he did fairly harmless drawings of teddy bears and things. And Robert encouraged him to let his inner self out. Of course, you have to remember, Rory was a speed freak. He was addicted to methamphetamines. So that kind of figured into his obsessive drawing style, his thousands of little pointillist spots and storylines that were really the story wasn't the purpose of his work. The purpose of his work was to express his tormented soul. A great story about Rory happened sometime probably in the mid or late 70s. I was in my apartment with my wife, Diane Newman, and Aileen was there too. And there's a knock on the door. We open the door and it's Rory, and his head is drenched in blood. Blood had dried up, trickled down from his scalp onto his face, and he seemed ignorant of it. I said, Rory, what happened? And he said, can I come in? I'd like a glass of milk. So we let Rory in. Aileen got very maternal. She starts dabbing away at his wound, and he gets a glass of milk. And we ask him what happened. And what happened was he was involved in a drug deal somewhere in the Mission District, and they robbed him and beat him up. They took his money and never gave him his drugs. And for some reason, he decided to come to my apartment to get a glass of milk to make himself feel better. Before he left, he had his sketchbook with him. So I said, Rory, can I look at your sketchbook? So we opened up the sketchbook, and there was a story. It was like it was the story of a movie they wanted to make. And it was pretty much panel by panel, like a movie. And it was just incredible. It was the first time I'd seen Rory doing a long narrative. As far as I know, that was never published. But also in the sketchbook, on the last page, it was his drug recipe, which consisted of speed, pot, and I think Rainier ale. And the total came to $7.
Damn.
Whether that was real or not, who knows? But this is the 70s. It could have been real. The last time I saw Rory was a number of years later, shortly before he died. And he was really in bad shape. He was hitchhiking on Army Street in San Francisco, which is a main kind of thoroughfare. And one pant leg was rolled up to the knee and one pant leg was down to the ankle. And his jacket was buttoned all wrong. And I pulled over to pick him up. I think I took him to the comic book store and I left him there. And that was the last time I ever saw Rory Hayes.
Today's video is brought to you by the comic books that we make. On the stands right now, Street Angel, Princess of Poverty, and Street Angel, Deadliest Girl Alive. Get both of these collections and you get all of Jimmy's Street Angel comics to date, including a comic that has never been published anywhere but Street Angel, Princess of Poverty. So you're getting some new value there. Jimmy's been self-publishing. He has True Crime Funnies 1 out there. He has the black and white zine, and he has the 1986 zine. Coming to you in May is the trade paperback of Hulk Grand Design. The Big Treasury book, it's been out of print. You might still find one or two in your local comic shop, but if you don't, make sure you pre-order the trade paperback. Get your hands on that thing. I've been doing daily comic strips. It's called Switchblade Shorties, and this is one of those strips. It's on all our social media. I have a Webtoon account for that. I'll be doing videos on Kayfabe. It's on our Kayfabe Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. Hip Hop Family Tree Omnibus, 500 plus pages of Hip Hop Family Tree with 150 pages of additional materials out there right now. Red Room Crypto Killers comes out on, I think, like the 14th or something. It's the last round of Red Room Comics. It's the best round of Red Room Comics. You could start here and check out the rest later, or just continue the trend. And the X-Men Grand Design Trilogy trade paperback is out there right now today, collecting all of my X-Men Grand Design works. Now that we are done paying the bills, let's go back to the video.
That is kind of a legendary fertile ground, San Francisco in the 70s, late 60s, early 70s for Cartoonist. How important was it for you to find a community of cartoonists? Is that part of what drew you to San Francisco?
That's why I went there. When I did my first comics, like I mentioned, in New York in 1969, but it quickly became apparent that there was a very limited venue of places to publish your stuff. There was Screw, and there was the East Village. There was briefly one or two other weeklies, but they came and went. And of course, I saw Crumb's early Zap comics, and that, lit a fuse in me, and I was determined to make my own underground comic, to graduate from newspapers into the comic book form. And that was all happening in San Francisco. There was nothing like that in New York. So along with almost everybody else in the underground that were not in San Francisco yet, I left. I remember Justin Green came after me. Art Spiegelman came a little bit after me. Before me, Kim Deitch came. Jay Kinney also came right around that time, 1970. I don't know if you've seen a map that Jay Kinney created long time ago, showing the location where each underground cartoonist lived in San Francisco during the underground heyday. There were 16 of us, and we all lived within about 10 blocks of each other.
That's amazing. Where would this map be printed? Issue Weirdo or something, maybe?
I'll tell you where to see it, because I just saw it reprinted. Fantagraphics just came out with a book of Willie Murphy's comics called Flamed Out Comics. Willie Murphy was one of the undergrounders. He was my roommate, actually. And in that book, they reproduced Jay Kinney's map. Yeah.
Awesome.
We every time a comic came out, we would have a party. The publishers were the Print Mint in Berkeley, Last Gasp in San Francisco, and of course Ripoff Press. And then briefly a publisher called Company and Sons, which published Young Lust, because nobody else would publish it. I remember Gilbert Shelton told me that Young Lust He liked it, but he didn't think he could defend it in court as having any redeeming social value.
Which is important at that time because of obscenity laws, I'm sure.
Yeah.
We would go through old comics journals where stores are getting busted for that exact issue. Can you lay out some of the culture of the various publishers that were coming out of the underground? For instance, I know Last Gasp, it's like, the last gasp of clean oxygen. They're kind of more environmentalist minded. How about the other guys?
Well, Ripoff, of course, was their main source of income was the Frick brothers, and they started out as a group of Texas cartoonists, came from Austin, and came to San Francisco via Los Angeles. So they all had kind of an affinity and a history with each other, going back to their days in Austin. And I would say they were the hippie publisher. They stood for hippie values, and they stood for a kind of raising the hippie flag, comics wise. So they liked stories that involved drugs and sex and rock and roll and all that stuff. Well, at the same time, Gilbert Shelton was not his personality was not like that. He was kind of a quiet, studious kind of a guy, and a good businessman. He partnered with a guy, I can't remember his last name. Fred was his first name. Fred had a degree in accounting, but he looked like your average San Francisco hippie, but he had a degree in accounting. So he kept the business going. He was really, Ripoff was, in terms of business, they were really on top of things, which is odd because they were also advocating, smoking a lot of pot all the time. Last Gasp, of course, was all controlled by Ron Turner. Still is. He's still around. And yes, his angle was more political and social. He published Trina's first comic, It Ain't Me, Babe. So feminist comics, and in Slow Death comics, which was all about the environment, ringing an alarm way before any current alarm ringers. So his purpose was, to have a message and be political. The print mint was run by a couple, Bob and Peggy Rita, and their partner, I know his last name was Schenkman. I'm trying to think of his first name. Anyway, Bob Rita came out of the farm workers' strikes culture. The print mint published or printed, political stuff about the farm workers' strike going on in the Valley in California. So Bob had absolutely zero background in comics. I remember when I brought in Tales of Toe #1 to him, his only real concern was that it wasn't the right number of pages. It was 28 pages and it had to be 32. And they did Arcade. The print mint had the most money. They had Zap, and they had lots of stuff to sell aside from comics. So they sold lots of posters. They had a bookstore on Telegraph Avenue in Berkeley. So they had the best cash flow. That was why we took Arcade to them, because we wanted a budget for Arcade. We wanted more than just a publisher. We wanted somebody to bankroll a magazine, which Bob Rita did. Company and Sons was run by a guy named John Bagley. I found out later that he had a criminal record, drug busts in LA. He had a partner who was a poet, whose name I can't remember. And we brought them Young Lust because none of the other publishers would take it. And he was more than anxious to publish it. When my relationship with Company and Sons ended, I had discovered that he had printed over 100,000 copies of Young Lust #1 and never told me about them. I actually located where they were because he was long out of business at that point. So yeah, they were all different. The cartoonists that worked with them kind of went from one to the other. I had no particular loyalty towards one or the other. They all seemed equal in many ways to me. I think the distribution and sales were pretty similar. Basically, at that point, comics were being sold in head shops.
Right.
Which is why Art and I created Arcade, to get out of that system, to get into a wider readership.
Bill, you've described these different publishers and kind of their, I don't know, point of view in underground comics. What attracted you to the underground comics? Was it political freedom? Was it art? Like what drew you to the undergrounds?
Well, all I can say is, in 1967, a friend of mine, a close friend of mine, saw an ad in probably the East Village Other. Send $1 and get a copy of Zap Comics #1. So he sent the $1, he got the comic, and he brought it over to my apartment, and I read it with him, and I felt like, how did this guy get into my head? And the second thought I had was, this is a really cool, old-fashioned drawing style. This guy must not be of my generation. He must be like in his 60s, because he would have to have lived through the 30s to develop this funky drawing style. I was at that time I was painting. I had gone to art school in the early 60s, Pratt Institute in Brooklyn. My goal, was very romantic. I thought I would someday be discovered, have a gallery show, and I would be Vincent van Gogh Jr. So that clearly was not happening. My paintings were influenced at that point by pop art a little bit. So word balloons were popping up in my paintings. So I was kind of unconsciously heading towards comics without really quite realizing it. I was also, I think, suppressing a comedian and a storyteller in me, which was not being expressed with painting. So when I saw Zap, it just opened a door in my head, and I thought, this is how I can best express all the things that I'm not expressing. Very arrogant of me. I picked up the wrong tools to work with. I used a speedball, #3 round point on heavy illustration board to do my first comics. I didn't know that you had to erase the pencil before it was printed, otherwise the pencil would pick up. I remember I brought my first strip to the art director at Screw, who was Steve Heller, who later became the art director of the New York Times book review, and then the head of the School of Visual Arts illustration department. Anyway, he was the art director. He was just another hippie in this apartment somewhere that I brought my work to, and I gave it to him, and a week later it was published. And then I went back and I said, Steve, I was completely naive. I said, how many copies of this thing were printed, of this issue? He said 10,000. What? If 10 people saw my paintings, I was happy. Now it was 10,000. Then I asked him later, many years later, I said, Steve, why did you print my first strip? It was terrible. It was just awkward and weird. He said, well, you drew it to the right proportions, and nobody else did.
You could imagine that too with that era of comics, even because even in the underground, you'll see strips that have a bigger margin at the top and bottom. Man, exactly. Bill, yeah. I bet that must have been a big headache with Arcade, corralling all of those guys to draw within certain parameters.
Yeah, occasionally. The biggest headache was working with S. Clay Wilson. His basic attitude towards us was to use us as errand boys. So we would come over to get his work for that issue, when he'd say, well, I'm out of cigarettes, go get me some cigarettes. I'm out of beer, get me some beer. He was an abusive personality. I never saw the charming aspect of that. Some people did. I never did. I thought of him as kind of a bully. And I loved his work, but we had very little to talk about with each other. Otherwise, everybody was much better. Robert was happy to do the covers and to do some of his best work. Our requirement was do your best work. That was the requirement. That was, there were no themes other than that. Sometimes we would encourage a specific cartoonist to go into a certain direction. Like we had Spain. Spain was really good at doing biography, real life biography, even, in the underground. And so we had him, we said, who would you like to do a biography of? And he said, Joseph Stalin. We said, okay, go ahead. Spain, he called himself a Stalinist. So what can you say?
That that just occurred to me too, man. That probably my favorite Crumb comic, That's Life, was that was in Arcade.
Yeah, that's right. Now, Crumb did great work for us. He did Modern America, another great story, and of course his covers. We were aware that Robert was the selling point. Of all of us we knew, Robert was the only one that was truly commercial. And, well, I guess you could call the Freak Brothers commercial too, and Young Lust. But, very few cartoonists or comic books, broke out into the hundreds of thousands. The exception being the Freak Brothers, Zap, and Young Lust, and maybe a few others. But we were happy to do 10 or 20,000 copies. And the page rate was $25. It graduated to $50 during Arcade, but it never got much more than that. And so, the goal would be to do as much work as possible to avoid having a day job, which is what I did.
I feel like that's still a
strategy
that we
use.
I
thought you were going to say it's still the same page rate.
Oh, yeah, in some cases, unfortunately. Bill, I have notes down here about you helping to form the United Cartoon Workers of America and the Cartoonist Co-op Press. And both of those things, well, can you tell us a little bit about those?
Well, the Cartoon Workers of America was more of an idea than a reality, but we had meetings. Spain created a logo for us. The purpose was to, go from the early days of undergrounds into try to take a next step into a more commercial realm. I don't know. We would talk about each other's financial difficulties, like how hard was it to be a working underground cartoonist? What could we do about that? Could the publishers afford to pay us more? I remember we actually bought art supplies together. We got a discount because we bought them all together. I remember once I went to a meeting with my X-Acto knife, my number 11 X-Acto blade, and I held it up and I said, do you guys know how to change the blade of the X-Acto knife? It's never written in instructions when you buy it. And they said, oh, that's always a problem. So I unscrewed it and I pulled out the blade and I put it back in and screwed it back together, and they all went, that's how it works. That was a great moment. I remember Trina was very serious about the Cartoon Workers of America thing. And Spain was. I wasn't serious. I was just part of it. What I was really part of was the Cartoonist Co-op Press that was created right after this economic huge downturn in 1973, I think it was, when the Supreme Court ruled on the definition of pornography. And the ruling was that pornography is up to the local authorities. The local communities define pornography. However they define it is how it would be viewed by the law. So crusading DAs across the country would initiate busts of comic book shops and head shops for selling underground comics, because even though it said adults only, the assumption was a comic book per se is done for children. So the adults only meant nothing to them. So they busted not the publisher and not even the store owner, but the clerk behind the counter. This put a freeze, as you can imagine, on underground comic book distribution. Stuff got returned in droves. Until then, returns were not possible. This was an odd relationship that underground publishers had, with no returns. You order 20 copies. If you sell 15, you eat the 5. We don't return them. So all of a sudden they were being returned. So our livelihoods were being threatened. I thought this possibly was the end of the whole system. And at that point, this was my livelihood, doing underground comics, and as was a bunch of others. So we thought, why don't we, the cartoonists, publish our own stuff? The printer that all of the comic publishers used was in San Francisco. It was a company called Warren's Waller Press. And they did everything. This was way before things were done in Canada or Singapore. So we contacted the press. We found out what it cost to publish one comic, which was prohibitive, because then we found out quickly you have to publish 4, minimum of 4, to make financial sense. So I thought, okay, my roommate is Willie Murphy. He's going to help us with this. Kim Deitch was my old friend going back to art school, and I asked him to do a comic. And I asked Jay Lynch. Jay Lynch was the only major underground cartoonist not living in San Francisco. Jay Lynch and Dennis Kitchen were both. Jay Lynch was in Chicago, and Dennis was in or around Milwaukee. So I asked Jay Lynch, and he was ready to do it. I don't know we found a guy named Jerry Lane. I don't know how I found him. I can't remember. He did 2 issues of Middle Class Fantasies, I think. One of them for us, and then disappeared. I know that he was from Fresno, so it might have been through Last Gasp, because Ron Turner was from Fresno. Anyway, so he was our 4th guy. So each of us had to put up the money to publish our own comic. And then we had Justin Green's brother, Keith, as our salesperson. Keith was a coke addict. He wore platform shoes, and he smoked. And when he smoked, his cigarette ashes dropped onto the front of his shirt as he was talking to you. This was not a good salesman. So yes, it failed. We published 4 comics. We sold them eventually. We did 10,000 of each. And the Cartoonist Co-op Press offices consisted of a table in my hallway in my apartment. And Diane Newman, Willie Murphy, and myself. I don't think Art was involved directly with this. No, he wasn't. But Kim Deitch, they helped out. But we didn't have what the publishers had, which they had. Even though the distribution system was now under threat, at least they had a system. We didn't have a system. We had to create a separate system with this coke snorting brother, Justin Green's. Yes. I think of myself as a decent businessman, but my track record when I actually start businesses is not very good. It's okay when I deal with other businesses. I remember whenever I did a story for any one of the underground publishers, I would not ask for all the money up front for what I was owed. If it was $200, I would say, give me $50 a month, so that I could look at my future and say, yeah, I have such and such an amount owed to me, and it's going to come in on a monthly basis, and rather than get it all at once and then not have it. So I did that.
You had some key points to the conversation, because guys like Bob Bierbaum, who was a retailer in the San Francisco area as well, he is always talking about how it was the underground comics guys who are the original direct market. And when we think of direct market, we think of non-returnable comics. So you clearly illustrate that in this conversation. Mm-hmm. One of the things that we should certainly jump to the Zippy era, the daily strips and stuff. And the first thing that comes to mind really is there was kind of famous conversations. It's usually from Matt Groening's point of view, when he's talking about coming up in the 70s in LA with with Gary Panter and how they're going to like strike on pop culture. And we know how Groening did it with The Simpsons. Gary Panter does it subversively through Pee-wee's Playhouse. But I put Zippy up there as well as like one of these tentpole sort of artistic creations that infiltrates pop culture. I mean, Zippy is a pinhead, and it is in daily newspapers. That is unbelievable.
Yeah, I know. I it still doesn't make any sense to me. Zippy is published every day in my local paper, the Hartford Courant, which is the oldest continuously publishing daily newspaper in the United States. It's a shadow of its former self, but 2 full pages of comics, and there I am, right below Blondie and next to Family Circus, and it blows my mind every time I see it. It doesn't make any sense. When it first happened, once again, this was not a planned career. In 1985, when I did Zippy Daily for the Examiner, that was because Will Hearst III, the young Hearst, he was in his 30s at that time, asked if he could have the San Francisco Examiner more or less to play with. It was a dying newspaper even then. It was the afternoon newspaper in San Francisco. So the Hearst family said, okay, it's going down the toilet. Let's give it to Will and see what he can do with it. So Will right away contacted me, and he contacted Crumb, and he contacted Hunter Thompson, and he asked all 3 of us to do regular features for the new Examiner. The end of that story for me is that I did. Robert didn't want to do it, but Aileen did. So Aileen said, let's do a dirty laundry strip. And they did 20 strips, all of which were completely full of graphic sex and nudity. And they handed it to Will Hearst. That was the end of that. Those were never published. Hunter Thompson did 1 or 2 stories. Then he just dropped out of sight. I remember Will enticed him back into San Francisco for a meeting, and it was kind of a meeting/party at the Fairmont Hotel, which I went to. And I entered the room, and there was Hunter Thompson, and I asked him what he thought of my Zippy strip, and he said I hated it, garbage. He said it was absolute garbage. Later that week, when Hearst went back to have his real talk with Hunter Thompson, he was met with gunfire at the door.
Seems on brand.
Yeah, I mean, really, Hunter Thompson shot through the door at Will Hearst in the hallway. This got into the papers, so that was the end of Hunter and the end of Robert, but I stuck with it. And so after about a year, King Features in New York, a guy there, I think he was a vice president named Alan Prio. He called me up. He said, we'd like to take Zippy nationwide with King Features. And I dropped the phone. What the hell? I said, well, I don't know what to say. He said, can I come out and talk to you? I said, okay, let's meet at the Examiner. So he comes to the Examiner and we meet, and I went there with a list of demands, intending this list to basically be the kiss-off. He acceded to every single one of them. Some of them were financial. I demanded a certain amount of money every week, no censorship, although I agreed I wouldn't use 4-letter words or graphic sex. So he immediately said yes to everything. There I was suddenly with facing King Features daily syndication. A week later, they flew me to New York to meet with the salespeople, and I was supposed to tell them how to sell Zippy to daily newspapers across the country. And all I could say was, just tell them it's the weirdest comic strip you've ever seen, and just hope that they like that idea. I said, maybe you'll encounter comics editors from my generation. That might help. They managed to sell the paper the strip to a number of papers, enough to keep it going. And about 6 months after Zippy had begun syndication, I got another call from Alan Prio, and he said he was leaving King Features. And I thought, uh-oh, this is the end of me. And he said, and I want to thank you, Bill, for leaving a ticking time bomb on my doorstep. Zippy was a ticking time bomb, and it went off, and Alan Prio left King Features. Then Jay Kennedy came along, luckily for me, and Jay Kennedy became my protector for a number of years. So I was okay there. So I don't know. Does that answer? I don't know. I forget what question you asked.
Were you? I'm curious about the feedback that Zippy generated because, again, researching a little bit, there've been some. It seems like it's generated quite a bit of response, positive and negative. Was that something that you were getting early on, whenever it goes into syndication?
Yeah, especially early on. I don't get it much anymore. I would get I would get criticism from several fronts. The first one was people who didn't get it. And when you don't get something, you don't accuse the person that you don't get of being, you don't say it's your fault. You say it's the person who created the work that's their fault. So I would get these letters that would say this was the stupidest strip they ever saw. Of course, what they're really saying is that they're too stupid to get it. That's the context. And it didn't make sense that Zippy was right below Blondie and Dagwood because obviously this was not the intended audience for the Zippy strip. The daily newspaper world was never the intended audience. I found an audience in almost only big city newspapers, of course. The biggest daily audience for Zippy was and still is in the Boston Globe. And Zippy began in the Boston Globe as a daily even before King Features. It was during my time with the Examiner when I started. The Globe asked if they saw Examiner. The Examiner ran Zippy Daily and they picked it up. So, and in all the major cities, from LA to Miami to, Chicago, Portland, LA, San Francisco, whatever, those were my readers. But in places where Zippy never should have been seen, I would get these outrage letters. Some of them would just call it, drug-induced hippie communist stuff. They would, every word that you could bring up that would denigrate me, they would use. Then there was the response by some people that I was making fun of handicapped people. So Zippy is the term pinhead comes from sideshow parlance, meaning a person with microcephaly. So, which just means a small head, a small, usually tapered head, and people with microcephaly have undeveloped cerebral cortexes. So, in various forms, they either are sort of childlike, or in some cases, they are pretty much just incapable of taking care of themselves. So yes, Zippy comes from originally, among a few sources, but the main one being the movie Freaks from 1932, which I saw when I was a student in art school in New York in 1963. And the Schlitzie character in Freaks just lodged in my brain at that point. But I had no way to really deal with it because I wasn't a cartoonist yet. So from 1963 until 70, when I created Zippy, it was just sort of percolating in the back of my head. If anybody accused me of causing pain to people who had family members with microcephaly, I would instantly apologize. I would never defend myself. In the sense that I would, fight back against them, because these were people speaking out of pain. So I would just say, I'm terribly sorry if it brought up any issues for you, and all I can say is my intention is only to work through the Zippy character to use Zippy as a kind of a heroic figure, kind of a role model in a way. And that happened once in a phone interview, a radio interview in Santa Cruz, California, sometime in the mid-'70s. A local mental health clinic called in. And the minute I heard who they were, I thought I got ready for the assault. I was going to get accused of making fun of handicapped people. And instead they said there were quite a few people with microcephaly in their clinic. This was not just a clinic, this was a home. And they thought Zippy was like a superhero. And they were all doing drawings of Zippy. And would I like to come and see them? Which I did. And that was very rewarding. To me, Zippy is a cartoon character. Zippy's not a human being. I'm not making fun of handicapped people. I am using a kind of scrambled brain that I only admire to be a vehicle for storytelling and satire. And that's who Zippy is. And also wordplay. The times that I've met microcephalic people in my life, the first thing that you notice is their surreal wordplay. They speak in disconnected but very kind of poetic sentences. The first time I met a microcephalic guy, he said, "Are you still an alcoholic?" That was his first statement to me. So it just appealed to me that, as to use a character who doesn't conform to expectations, who has no filter, who doesn't have a little man inside his head to say, "Don't say that." Zippy says whatever he is thinking, and then he says whatever he is thinking next, and then next, and then it's up to the reader to put those together and find out why it's funny. My purpose in doing a Zippy strip is to make people laugh. That's the best reward I hear. If somebody emails me, tomorrow morning and says, "Wow, yesterday's strip I'm in tears and laughter." That's my ultimate reward.
Was there ever like a big spike in new papers, or a bunch of papers drop you? I guess the question is, was there any kind of like controversy that moved the needle for the strip throughout its tenure, beginning in '85? I think of Bobby London did Popeye comic strips, and then he inserts like a vague abortion storyline, and then that gets a lot of buzz. Kathy Geiswhite will flat out say, "Hey man, you got to vote for Michael Dukakis," and the strip turns into that and a bunch of papers get dropped. So for your career, has there been any big things?
Yeah, well, no, I've never actually. You can't point to a certain strip or a series of strips that caused papers to cancel Zippy, but what you can point to is popularity contests. Newspapers have popularity contests all the time. They say, rate your favorite comic, the top 10 comics, or top 25, whatever. And Zippy always comes out at the bottom when they do those. Because people that answer surveys, in the past at least, tended to be older. They tended to be more the Beetle Bailey fan. And they would take this opportunity to rail against Zippy, this horrible communist masturbatory strip, whatever evil they wanted to place on it. So then I would get dropped. Then the Zippy fans who didn't respond to the survey would all clamor, what happened to Zippy? And they would write and call, and this is before email, and Zippy would be reinstated. This went on over and over and over again for me. Sometimes I helped instigate the response. So I, encouraged this kind of a reaction. And I think Zippy was dropped 4 times from the Washington Post. Each time it was painful for me because you never know. Maybe that's it. That's the end of it. And also, since I had only big city papers pay the most money. The way syndicate income works is the syndicate and the cartoonists share in all the money that comes in from the newspapers. So if a newspaper is paying $100 a week for a strip, and your deal with the syndicate, your cartoonist deal with the syndicate is 50-50, so you get $50 and they get $50. Once a paper drops you, that's the end of that income. You're not working for a salary. You're working by piecemeal. So since I had mostly big city papers, if they dropped Zippy, that was a significant piece of income.
That exact thing happened to the Pittsburgh Post Gazette. They dropped Zippy for a moment, and then people like my mother, who this will be the only interview she watches from our entire YouTube channel. She even contacted the Post Gazette asking, like, where the heck did Zippy go?
Yeah. And my defense, King Features asked me to write to editors to defend Zippy and tell them why they should return Zippy. And I would say, the people who like Zippy are the influencers in your readership. These are the smartest people in your demographic. You don't want to lose those people. These are the people who, have disposable incomes. They give your newspaper a certain status, and Zippy is their strip. So, yes, maybe the Family Circus has higher ratings, but Zippy has a more preferred demographic than the Family Circus. The people who read Zippy are the hip, sophisticate audience that you want as you make the transition from whatever you are, in the past, to the glorious new future of daily newspapers, which of course never happened, but yeah. So I would give them that argument, and in some cases, it would actually work. In those days, newspapers had comics editors. They no longer have them. So I would deal sometimes very specifically with the comics editor to try to get Zippy back in the paper once it had been canceled. And those usually were my allies. They were all for Zippy. They were just responding to, this kind of conservative, angry response that tended to happen whenever they did a popularity contest.
It's so interesting because I think of Zippy as being sort of rebellious, subversive, counterculture, all those things that you would think would have the opposite effect on an audience, especially a comics reading audience. And yet it seems like it's viewed with disdain from that, in that
because,
way.
Okay. My purpose is to make you laugh, but the punchline doesn't always happen in the last panel. The funny moment can happen in the first, second, or third panel. That doesn't fit with the rhythm of reading daily comics. If you're reading daily comics one by one down the page, and the punchline is always at the end, and then you come to Zippy, and the punchline is sort of ambivalent. Is there even a punchline? Or was the moment of laughter in that second word balloon when Zippy responded to Griffey in that way? So some people, that didn't fit. Their presumption about how comics work. Zippy didn't deliver that expectation. Why do I like Nancy? Nancy is the diametric opposite of Zippy in many ways, the strip itself. But what I like is that Nancy is the strip that is not about character or social comment. Nancy is the strip that's about comics. It's a strip about how comics work. Ernie Bushmiller did not care if you liked or cared for the characters. That wasn't his interest. The characters were there to deliver a punchline. And in his case, the punchline, of course, was always in the last panel. And it was engineered from back to front. So he would come up with the punchline in his head, a funny image, usually a juxtaposition of things. And then he would say to himself, how can I get there? And he would work backwards to the to the lead in to the punchline. So yeah, why do I like Nancy so much? I guess you like things that are your opposites. It's all can. Of course, Nancy has this, to me, as an intense, a surreal charge, as Zippy, to me when I look at Nancy. Just the fact of Nancy walking down a sidewalk in a Bushmiller panel with one tree and three rocks and a little house in the background on the horizon line. To me, that's just charged with surrealism and intensity, and something that I try to do with Zippy all the time. So how did we get off on Nancy?
Well, you know what? We can go down this road a little bit. I absolutely love this book. This is, for anybody at home, this is Three Rocks. This is Bill's book about Ernie Bushmiller and the Nancy comic strip. And I wonder, have you been a Nancy fan like lifelong? Is that something that you grew up reading and loving?
Yes and no, because I grew up reading Nancy, literally. So I can remember being about 5 years old, living in my family in Brooklyn, and getting the Sunday funnies in the newspapers on Sunday. And the strip that I was most attracted to was Nancy. Why? Not the characters, not the humor, but the lettering. The big lettering and lack of punctuation. There were pretty much no commas and no periods in a Nancy word balloon. And the lettering was super big and neat and easy to read. So I would read them and then show them to my parents and then read them out loud to my parents to show them what I could do. I didn't do it with, I would never have done it with Dick Tracy. Dick Tracy was incomprehensible to me. But Nancy, and of course the fact that the characters were simply made and iconic, that helped. But I wasn't interested in the jokes. I was just interested in the lettering and the words. So that went on for a while. I kind of drifted away. I became a Scrooge McDuck fan and then a huge Mad Magazine fan, and kind of drifted away from Nancy. I got back to Nancy in 1970 through Art Spiegelman. So in San Francisco, I'm visiting Art, and Art gave me an education in comics, literally. So Art had even at that age, at that moment in his life, he had a vast knowledge of comics history. Compared to me, I had almost none. I heard of Crazy Cat, and I heard of Little Nemo. I think I saw both of them at art school because Kim Deitch had the early anthologies of both of them put out by Woody Gelman, Nostalgia Press. So I had seen a Crazy Cat and thought, wow, this is incredible. And I saw Little Nemo and I thought, wow, this is trippy. But then in 1970, when Art started talking about comics history to me, we talked about Nancy. And he showed me a book put out in the 40s called Comics and Their Creators, which gave brief bios of all the major daily cartoonists. And so for the first time, I found out who Ernie Bushmiller was. And that began a revival in my head of an interest in Nancy. My use for it right away was to put Nancy and Sluggo into Zippy strips. I would just insert them in here and there. I remember using the Three Rocks in very early 70s underground comics where Zippy would approach the Three Rocks and they would engage in dialogue with each other. And so that's how Nancy got revived. And then in 1985, Brian Walker put out a book called The Best of Nancy, and he asked me to do a story about Nancy, whatever I wanted. So I did a story in the style of Bushmiller, I created Bushmiller. I didn't know what he looked like in 1985, so I made him up. I made him into a kind of a cartoon character with a big nose and a mustache. And and then I read what Brian did, and Brian put together this book called The Best of Nancy, and that really was what it was. Because if you read the Fantagraphics anthologies of Nancy, if you read them in order, you read any daily strip in order, there's a peak and valley quality to a daily strip. It's not always at its peak. Sometimes it's kind of boring and repetitive, and then it gets good again, then it gets boring again. But Brian put all the peaks, all the high points together in one book. And whenever anybody asks me, why Nancy? What's so good about Nancy? I say, look at this book. Look at Brian Walker's book. That will tell you.
Bill, when you began doing the graphic novel stuff, did that change the way that you work on the daily strip? Did you start working smaller? I asked that because I saw some recent photos of that you took in your studio, and one of your dailies is on the board, and I remember seeing some older dailies. I feel like they were bigger.
No, they're the same size.
Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, whatever you saw, I know the picture you saw.
Yeah.
Whatever that. Those are the same size. Okay. They're 5 and 3/4 high by 13 inches wide, and they've been the same. That was an interesting thing when I started doing Zippy. I was doing Zippy at that size for weekly papers, and then for the Examiner started Zippy on page 2 of the front section, which pissed off Randolph Hearst, the father of the Hearst family at that point, who actually lived in San Simeon. He hated Zippy, and he had to look at it every day because it was on page 2. He eventually convinced Will Hearst to put Zippy on the comics page. But okay, I never, unlike my first strip for Screw, I did not measure, since I was already doing a weekly Zippy, I didn't measure the proportions of a daily strip. If I had measured it, I would have noticed that my strip was about a half an inch too high. So when I told the King salesman how to sell Zippy, one of the things I said is it's taller than other strips because I use more words, and let the editors know this. So when they paginate the strip, when they put all the other strips together, they allow my little extra 1/4 inch or half inch on the page. So Zippy has, even in the daily strip world, he appears slightly larger. Gary Trudeau's strip used to appear larger. Over the years, it got conformed to a more conventional size, but at first it was also taller. And my reason wasn't literally that I used so many words that I needed that space, but that was true. I did need that space. I remember Gilbert Shelton once criticized my work by saying I used too many words. And I told him, well, Gilbert, I hate to say it, but you don't use enough words. I remember another moment when I had been doing Zippy for a couple of years, and I got up the nerve to ask Art Spiegelman what he thought of Zippy, because he had never literally, told me. And I said, what do you think of Zippy? And he said, well, Bill, it's a great strip. I love the character, but I wouldn't want to get stuck in an elevator with Zippy. And I laughed and thought, that's that's very funny art. Yeah, great joke. I went home that night and thought, oh my God, have I burnt myself out with Zippy's personality? Is his unhinged, loose cannon, persona over? Are people saying, I don't want to be in an elevator with this guy? That next day, I had already created the Griffey character in separate weekly strips. So that next day, I added Griffey into the Zippy world, and then it all made sense. That allowed me to keep doing it because, yes, Zippy is unreal, but he's rooted, at least post 1973 or 4, he's rooted in the real world. And Griffey is more than rooted in the real world. Griffey is his opposite. So they're like a comedy team, a straight man and a goofy character. And that allowed me to keep doing Zippy from then on.
Bill, curious about like the graphic novels, especially Nobody's Fool. How do you get into researching that? You know, I've come across that you talked to primary sources. This would have been, I assume, long after Schlitzie had passed. Like, how do you track down the research to do a biography like that?
Well, God bless the internet. I mean, it's amazing what you can find. I came across just, Googling and surfing. I came across several kind of short essays by people who had worked with Schlitzie on circus sideshow websites. One of them was his last caretaker. So Schlitzie died in 1971 at the age of about 70, and he was no longer performing. He had performed fairly recently, but he was no longer performing because he was ill. He had all kinds of physical problems. And the guy who took care of him wrote like a 5-page little essay about what it was like to take care of Schlitzie. There it was right in front of me. I tried to contact that guy and never could find him. At the same time, I found another little article by someone who, at the age of 18, had spent the summer touring with Schlitzie in a Canadian circus that toured throughout Canada. When I looked further into him, I found he was still around. He was my age, and he lived in Northampton, Massachusetts, about an hour and 15 minutes from where I live. So that wasn't hard to track him down. Without him, I wouldn't have had the kind of insight I had into Zippy as a human, as a person. I had lots of reminiscences that I found here and there from people who worked with him in the sideshow, but they were all pretty much, people who were sort of spouting sideshow misinformation. They would say Zippy ate grasshoppers on the stage, and they would talk about, not Zippy, there you go. That Schlitzie, they would talk about Schlitzie as if he was being shown in the sideshow. They would portray him the way he was sold to the public, which was something you could get easily from sideshow banners and Barker talk. But Wolf, the guy who I talked to, who worked with Schlitzie in Canada in the mid '60s, he was not a sideshow personality guy. He was a sensitive young college student. He was reading Jean-Paul Sartre's Being and Nothingness while he was traveling with the circus that summer. And out of just default, he became Zippy's kind of babysitter. I mean, I keep saying Zippy. Schlitzie's babysitter. Schlitzie required someone to sort of take care of his physical needs. He wore a diaper, and he was dressed in a woman's muumuu because that gave easy access to changing the diaper. Schlitzie had the kind of mental abilities of about a 4-year-old child, which is fairly advanced. Microcephaly comes in various degrees. Schlitzie was capable of feeling, of happiness, of love. and but he needed somebody to take care of him, and Wolf was that guy for that summer. So Wolf had a intimate relationship with somebody that he thought was a transcendently special human being. So that kind of insight into Schlitzie, it came from nowhere but him, and it was absolutely groundbreaking for me to do the book, because until then I could just assume that Schlitzie had a real had a life, had ups and downs, liked things, hated things, but I was given this portrait by this man who had the sensitivity to really see who Schlitzie was. And I mean, the other person that gave that to me was someone I never met, but I read about. He was the sword swallower, and during the 1950s, that traveled with Schlitzie. And his career was that this was very common with sideshow performers, during most of the year, they would travel with circuses, but during the winter, when circuses were, in hiatus, they would have to have other forms of employment. So this sword swallower had a job as an orderly in the Los Angeles County Hospital, which happened to be where Schlitzie was placed when his adoptive parents died in the early 60s. And Schlitzie was wasting away alone in a kind of a Dickensian asylum that this LA County Hospital was, when all of a sudden the sword swallower came upon him and rescued him and pulled him out and put him back on the sideshow circuit and gave him his final chapter, in which he was reunited with all of his old sideshow performers. So, some of those were accident, some of those were research, but they all, I needed them all to make a real picture of Schlitzie. So I wasn't just doing a sensationalist kind of approach.
When you decided to do that book, had you been researching it out of your own personal interest, and then realized you had enough information there, or something? Like, was there a moment whenever you were like, this can be a book?
All three, and now I'm working on a fourth of my graphic novels, began their life very early as just ideas and little notes that I would make to myself. So yeah, the Nobody's Fool, the idea of finding out who this inspiration for my Zippy character was in real life, finding out his real story, was an idea that I had as early as, I would say, the early 70s. And I would just make notes about it to myself. I remember when Mouse came out, as much as I loved it and do, of course, it made me question myself. Do I have a graphic novel in me? And I would always answer it by, I guess so, but not yet. After all, I have to do a daily strip, 7 strips a week, 365 strips a day. I have other things that I have to do. My plate is full. I can't possibly do a graphic novel. But in whenever it was, 2013, 2014, when that little voice inside my head stopped saying that, I thought, what the heck? I'll do it little by, I'll do it little by little. I'll do it incrementally. I'll start the graphic novel with a page, and then I'll see if I can do page 2 and then page 3. And little by little, I will accumulate what's needed for a graphic novel, which is usually around 200 pages or more. And I had no deadline. I told Gary Groth that I was going to do this Invisible Ink book first. And of course, he was happy to not give me any deadline. So I found that I could fit it in. I found that I would work on my daily strip Monday to Friday, and on my graphic novels Saturday and Sunday. And that's how it worked for the first and the second. The third, Three Rocks, got interrupted by the COVID thing, so that was over a year delay there, which gave me the chance actually to move ahead with my current graphic novel, which is about my great-grandfather, who was a famous photographer.
Bill, would you do the color separations for your Sundays? Or not the separations, but guides, or do you have an assistance?
A color guide.
Yeah.
Today, of course, all the Zippy strips are in color, and that's done by the company that works with King Features called Reed Brennan, RBMA, in Orlando, Florida. When Zippy, the daily strip, started being all in color, I just gave them a color guide. I said, here's Zippy's colors, his costume, here's Griffey's hair color, here are the different characters' basic colors, and obviously I would not do the color. But on the Sunday, going back to when it began, and the Sunday Zippy started in 1990. And for those strips, I would do a Xerox of the black line art, and I would color pencil it in, color all the colors in color pencil. And then each color, I had a chart that King Features gave me that I still have. Each color has a number, and I would just write the little number inside each area. Like for Zippy, I would just say regular colors, but if the background included a graduated blue sky, I would say, 10% blue at the bottom, 50% blue at the top. And all the other colors also all had numbers. The color chart that King gives me only has maybe 100 or 150 colors. In reality, there are over 100,000 colors available in 4-color printing. But I'm happy with the 150 that I have. That's all I need. And so to this day, I do a color guide every Sunday. But during the day, during the dailies, somebody is just doing what they do. I have currently somebody, King Features won't let me talk to them for some reason. The person who does my daily color is really doing a great job. They don't just do, pump it out with no inspiration. They're really into it. But for some reason, I'm not allowed to talk to that person to tell them how wonderful they are. But so I still do the Sunday. No, I don't actually do the color. I do the color guide.
Right.
My color ability in Photoshop is decent. I can do Photoshop.
Do you do you color the covers to like the Fantagraphics Zippy collections and stuff? Is that what we might see?
Those are also done as color guides. So I do a complete colored pencil of the black line art, and at first I would give Fantagraphics how to make each color that I have. Once not based on the King Features chart, but on the 100,000 chart. And gradually I realized that I didn't have to do that. They knew what I wanted. If I drew a light purple, they knew that was 10% red and 10% blue. And so I didn't have to do all the numbers on each color. But no, I never did the color myself. I worked with, what's his name? Another guy that does most of the color.
Paul Barish.
Paul Barish. So, yeah, he was he was wonderful to work with. He still is. And once in a while, I would have to do the color. I remember I would get illustration assignments now and then, and for those, I would get out my minimal Photoshop skills. And they seem to serve me okay. I can do color.
Bill, Thank you so much for joining us, man. We know you got a lot on your plate, man, with the daily strip and doing this graphic novel about was it your great grandpap or your grandfather?
Great grandfather William Henry Jackson. So Google him and you'll see
Yes.
hundreds of photographs that he took.
Right,
He was,
I remember you showing those
he
photos
was
off.
responsible for Yellowstone becoming the first national park because of his photographs in 1872.
That's incredible.
Wow.
Yeah.
I bet he's going to be mentioned. I'm watching these Ken Burns documentaries while drawing, and I know that there is a
National parks.
Yes, he was mentioned in Ken Burns. Yes.
Oh,
yeah.
you know what? Here's one final one to leave us on, because you got that Reuben. You got the Reuben last year, man, and it was Jim Davis. I run the risk of saying Jack Davis. It was Jim Davis who gave you your award, and that cracked me up because you're well on the record a lot of times talking about how Garfield is like everything that's wrong with comic strips and stuff.
Yeah.
So
not to mention the fact that at the 25th anniversary of Garfield, which was 10 or 15 years ago, the motto for all the public relations, blast of advertising about that big anniversary moment, the big motto was, "Are we having fun yet?" Which of course is credited to Zippy and Bartlett's familiar quotations. And when I got up on stage and I realized it was Jim Davis handing me the Reuben, he was wearing a key, his ID card, the ribbon around his neck, and it said, "Are we having fun yet?" on it with a picture of Garfield.
oh my goodness,
And
it's like trolling.
I wanted to say something, but it was too, he was just happy to hand me something, and I was supposed to then go to the microphone. So I didn't say anything. But talk about irony and talk about surreal moments. Yeah. Garfield is the anti-Zippy.
So ideally, who would be your dream cartoonist to sort of hand you that award? Would it be Bushmiller?
Well, God, yes. Oh man, I'm just blanked on the guy who created the Reuben statue. Who's the cartoonist?
Rube Goldberg.
Rube Goldberg. Okay. Rube Goldberg would have been a better choice, because Ernie was kind of a buttoned-up guy. There's only two recorded indications of him speaking, and he wasn't an effusive, funny guy in person. Whereas Rube Goldberg, that was what he did. His whole life was devoted to what they called smokers, going to these events and telling dirty stories to other cartoonists and stuff. So he would have been the guy that I would have loved to have gotten the reward from. I'm happy, of all the awards I've ever gotten, yes, I guess it's the biggest, and that's very nice to have gotten it, but I like it the most because it's a statue created by Rube Goldberg, one of my favorite cartoonists.
Yeah, that's fantastic, man. And you just mentioned the "Are we having fun yet?" quote, Bartlett's book of familiar quotations.
Mm-hmm.
I think we could answer that question right here today. Jimmy and I had a ball talking to you, Bill. So can you point people into to a direction online, on social media, the Zippy website, before we get out of here?
Yeah. Anybody wants to look at thousands of Zippy strips and look at stuff that you can buy, and contact me go to zippythepinhead.com.
And there's even the guide to Zippy the Pinhead on the website, I believe.
There's a section called How to Understand Zippy. I will hold your hand through the process.
That's fantastic. Thanks so much for joining us, Bill.
Thanks, Bill.
My pleasure.
Kayfabers, like, follow, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Hit the bell so that we can notify you when new videos are available. And make sure you subscribe. I'd like to hit 100K in 2024 in terms of our subscriber base. The videos are brought to you by a number of things, but the most important thing is that you support the books that we make. Right now, I'm starting daily comic strips. It's called Switchblade Shorties, and it's getting pretty crazy. So go on any of our social media, go on my Instagram, and you'll be able to see those comics. Some of the stuff that we have out in the wild right now: Hip Hop Family Tree Omnibus. This is the collection of all of my Hip Hop Family Tree comics and extra art that I've drawn. I've drawn some exclusive pages directly for this publication. It's going quick. Like we don't have very many copies left. You guys have been supporting it in a big way. So if you're interested in it, scoop it up soon. Red Room Crypto Killers, my third trade paperback of Red Room comics, is out there within days as of this recording. Might be out on the stands right now. Support the comic, Murder on the Dark Web for fun and profit. It's like Black Mirror meets EC Comics, and each story is completely self-contained. So you don't have to have the baggage of the other ones. But if you support them all, I'll be happy. X-Men Grand Design Trilogy trade paperback is in stores now, collecting all of my X-Men Grand Design works. Some of that stuff is out of print, so this is your way to get all of my X-Men Grand Design inside of one handy-dandy, handsome collection. Jimmy, what do you have out there?
Street Angel Princess of Poverty is just out from Image Comics. This collects all of the Street Angel comics that are not in Street Angel Deadliest Girl Alive, detailing the super heroic day-to-day life of the homeless ninja on a skateboard. I've also been self-publishing quite a bit with True Crime Funnies, the Black and White zine, and the 1986 zine. These are available on my website, jimrugg.com, or on my Patreon, patreon.com/jimrugg. And the Hulk Grand Design, my contribution to the Grand Design mythos. This treasury size edition that I'm very proud of, sold out. So if you can get it at your comic shop, get it, because they are harder and harder to find. But there is a trade paperback like the X-Men Trilogy Grand Design coming out in May from Marvel. You can pre-order that one right now if you missed the Hulk Grand Design Treasury.
So there's some other ways to support the channel. We have a Patreon, and the King Kayfabers on the Patreon get access to all of our videos before anybody else. Mitigates the kayfabe effect. Very often we talk about some comics that are reasonably rare on the aftermarket, and they snap the comics up before anybody else has the opportunity to. There are some direct ways to support the Cartoonist Kayfabe channel, however. Jimmy, lay some of those ways out.
You can subscribe to the Cartoonist Kayfabe e-newsletter at the links below this video. You can also find Cartoonist Kayfabe t-shirts, merchandise, hats, mugs, stickers, and more at our spread shop. That link is also under this video.
There you have it, man. There's all the ways to support the Cartoonist Kayfabe channel directly and indirectly. Why don't you leave everybody with the final marching orders, Jimmy, and we'll be on our way.
Read more comics.